For decades, a mahogany casket sat untouched in the farthest corner of a private royal vault, unmarked, unspoken of, and forbidden. No plaques, no insignias, no records, just a heavy presence that seemed to hum with secrets. It wasn't the sort of box that drew attention. In fact, it was designed not to, and that was precisely the point. Even the most senior palace staff knew better than to speak of it. Those who noticed it during inventory learned quickly to pretend they hadn't. Royal aides whispered about it once, and only once, before falling into careful silence. No one wanted to ask questions. Not in a palace where questions could cost you your position, or worse, your protection. The woman who owned it never spoke of it aloud. Not to her family, not to her ladies-in-waiting, not even to the private secretary who had served her loyally for over 30 years. But she had made one thing clear. The box would remain sealed until after her death. A locked directive, signed in her own hand and co-signed by the reigning monarch, was filed away in a restricted drawer in the royal archives. To be unsealed only by blood. 6 words, nothing more, no further clarification, no date, no details, just an iron command cloaked in velvet discretion. And so it waited. Through global events, abdications, scandals, and state funerals, it remained where she left it, unmoving, untouched, unchallenged. It survived inventory overhauls, system digitizations, and even a brief fire in the lower vaults that destroyed lesser valuables. But not this one. Somehow, this casket was always spared. Not because it was lucky, but because it was feared. Whispers that it held something too powerful to be seen circulated in the upper circles of royal protocol, but never reached the public ear. It wasn't just hidden. It was erased. Even those closest to her didn't know the full story. All they had were fragments. The time she'd descended alone into the vaults for nearly 2 hours and emerged visibly shaken. The rare moment when, during an unusually candid conversation over tea, she had said to a trusted confidant, "We all inherit things we never asked for. Some of us are just expected to bury them." A strange comment at the time, dismissed as an emotional musing. But now, in hindsight, it rings with a sinister echo. After her death, the Queen herself dispatched a private emissary to unlock the vault. Not a public procession. No state-led ceremonial audit. Just 2 gloved hands, a master key, and instructions whispered rather than written. And even then, hesitation thickened the air like dust. Royal protocol dictated cataloging, photography, preservation. But for this, no photographs were permitted. Only silence. And the expression on the emissary's face when he returned? Pale. Shaken. Eyes wide. He said only one thing before resigning the next day. She carried it alone so we wouldn't have to. Still, the box had not revealed its full truth. Not yet. Its contents, hidden for nearly half a century, were only beginning to speak. And not everyone wanted to hear what they had to say. Because once the lid was opened, it wouldn't just change how we saw her. It would change how we saw the crown itself. But the question remained. What was so dangerous, so sacred, that it had to be hidden? Even from history itself. These weren't just diamonds. They were secrets cut in stone, passed down not with pride, but in shame. Behind every facet was a story of betrayal, banishment, or royal revenge, and she inherited them not with a smile, but a trembling hand. Why? Because these jewels weren't meant to dazzle. They were meant to disappear. Their origin begins in the kind of place the crown never speaks of, behind closed bedroom doors, under the weight of scandal that could ruin bloodlines. In the late 1800s, A royal consort fell from grace in a way that no official biography would ever detail. Her affair, brief and passionate, with a foreign dignitary, already married, already controversial, led to her forced exile. The monarchy, still reeling from decades of unrest and power struggles, couldn't afford the stain. And so she was erased. Quietly. Brutally. Sent away with a name no longer hers and a warning that echoed across generations. Stay hidden, or be forgotten completely. But before her departure, she was given a gift. A final gesture from the man she loved and lost. A collection of diamonds unlike any other. Black as night, edged with strange iridescence. Some said they were from Africa. Others swore they were taken during a violent expedition in the East. Whatever their origin, their message was clear. These were not symbols of status, but of secrecy. The consort wore them once, and only once, on the night she vanished from public life. After that, the jewels disappeared from history, until, quietly, they began to resurface, tucked inside other family jewels, sewn into the linings of gowns, hidden beneath false bottoms of traveling trunks. They were never displayed, never worn in public, and never acknowledged in any official inventory. But those who knew what to look for, those who understood the signs, began to whisper. They called them the blacklight diamonds, not because of how they looked under ultraviolet rays, but because they brought out the shadows. Wherever they appeared, tragedy followed. A distant cousin who drowned mysteriously at sea, weeks after inheriting a pendant. A royal aide dismissed after revealing he'd discovered an unregistered gemstone in the Queen Mother's attic. Even a senior archivist who suffered a breakdown after being assigned to catalog an anonymous collection of jewels, rumored to contain the cursed stones. And always the same pattern: disappearance, silence, sealed records. She, our subject, had been warned. Not directly. The royal family doesn't do direct. But in hushed family stories, in the sudden change of subject when certain names were mentioned, and in one chilling passage written by her grandmother in a locked journal, passed down with an heirloom brooch, she must never wear them. Never let the light find them. But the warning came too late. By the time she read those words, the casket was already in her possession. She'd inherited it not through ceremony, but through omission. A legal gap. A name struck from the will. A vault key left on her vanity, with no note attached. It was not a gift. It was a test. And though she could have turned away, could have pretended not to know, she opened the casket anyway. Inside, the diamonds stared back. Cold, gleaming, unapologetic. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She simply sat, motionless, for hours. Because in that moment, she realized she had not inherited wealth. She had inherited silence, and the choice of whether to break it. But she did find them, and what she did next would rewrite her legacy, in complete silence. While the world watched her wave, curtsy, and smile, they missed the quiet rebellion burning behind her eyes. She never spoke of the diamonds, never wore them publicly. But she didn't destroy them either. Why? Because sometimes silence is louder than defiance. And sometimes a woman's greatest power is the secret she guards with her life. She found them in a place that shouldn't have existed. An undocumented wing of the old royal vault, sealed behind a false panel and marked only by the dust that had gathered since before her birth. No one had told her to go looking there. No one even knew she had the key. It had come to her in the form of a misplaced envelope, slipped between 2 pages of a book her grandmother once cherished. Inside, it was a single sentence. You will know where to go when the silence begins to ache. And ache it did, for years. When she opened the hidden door and stepped inside, what she found was not a chest or a display, just a velvet pouch, small, worn, the color of dried blood. She hesitated before touching it, as though the fabric itself might recoil. And when she untied it, the room fell still. Not because of the diamond's sparkle. No, these stones didn't shimmer. They stared back, cold and lifeless, like silent witnesses to something unholy. She clutched them in her hand, feeling the unnatural weight they carried. She knew instantly they were meant to be buried. But something in her refused. She didn't tell a soul, not her husband, not her private secretary, not even her closest companion, who had stood by her through scandal and sickness. This secret wasn't to be shared. It was hers to carry, and hers alone. But carrying it did not mean accepting it. She began to dig, quietly, obsessively, searching for answers buried as deeply as the diamonds themselves. She requested access to forgotten libraries in the North Wing, pulled estate documents no one had touched in 80 years, cross-referenced portraits, inventories, family Bibles, anything that might reveal the path these jewels had taken. And slowly, they began to speak, through omissions, contradictions, and the names that appeared once and then never again. At night, she would write. Her diary, once a place of polite reflection, turned into a battlefield of ink and agony. Cryptic entries filled the pages. The black glints again. They do not sleep when I do. She wore them once. That was her undoing. The handwriting changed, grew erratic, more slashes than strokes. And yet, she kept writing. Because this was not just a mystery. It was a reckoning. In time, the diamonds became more than relics. They became symbols. Of everything she was never allowed to say. Of the inheritance she never asked for. Of the rules she was expected to follow without question. And quietly, wordlessly, she began to push back. She would attend official events with bare necklines, deliberately refusing to wear sanctioned jewels. When offered tiaras for foreign visits, she'd decline, citing headaches. When pressed about heirlooms, she would simply reply, "Some treasures are best kept unseen." To the world, she remained gracious, composed, the perfect image of restraint. But behind her eyes, there was fire. And in her silence, there was revolution. Because for her, wearing those diamonds would have been surrender. Destroying them would have been denial. But hiding them, guarding them, was defiance. And though she never let them leave the vault again, she would return to them often. Not to admire, but to remember. That even in a world ruled by protocol, a woman could choose what part of her inheritance she allowed to shine, and what she chose to keep hidden, forever. But the palace was never truly blind, and soon the walls began to close in. In royal households, silence is a language, and in the corridors of power, someone is always watching. The moment she accessed the private vault, eyes turned. Not just staff, but those entrusted with the darker preservation of the crown. The watchers, the whisperers, the ones who keep secrets buried. It began with something as small as a ledger, a single visit logged at an unusual hour. The vaults, normally opened under strict schedule and supervision, had recorded an entry late in the evening. No staff present, no cross-verification, just her name. It was enough to raise quiet eyebrows and tighter surveillance. After all, the royal household had long since accepted that even those inside the family might one day need to be contained. Unbeknownst to her, Her movements had triggered a protocol. The Royal Protection Branch, the discreet, unnamed force buried deep within palace tradition, was alerted. These weren't the men seen in black suits at public events. These were the shadows behind the shadows. They had one purpose: to protect the integrity of the crown, not necessarily the individuals who wore it. And when those individuals stepped beyond what was deemed safe, surveillance followed. Her late-night visits to the archives grew more frequent, and so did the notes in confidential files. Requests for obsolete inventory. Withdrawals of royal correspondence sealed since the 19th century. A pattern began to form. She wasn't just reminiscing. She was looking for something. Something she had already found, but now needed to understand. That frightened them. A trusted lady-in-waiting, older than most, and steeped in quiet loyalty, pulled her aside after one such midnight inquiry. Her voice barely a breath. "They're listening now. Be careful what you think aloud." That warning wasn't poetic. It was literal. Rooms could be turned, phones tapped. Even private diaries scanned under the guise of preservation. Nothing was off-limits when preservation of the monarchy was in question. Then, without warning, her personal jewelry cleaner was dismissed. No explanation, no farewell. Replaced overnight by someone new, smiling, competent, but unfamiliar. The message wasn't subtle. They were close. Close enough to touch what was hers. Her closet was reorganized. Her calendar abruptly altered. Appointments she hadn't scheduled began to appear. Not malicious, just controlling. Gentle nudges designed to remind her that her independence was conditional. And then came the loyalty interview. She had heard of them, never undergone one. An invitation, phrased politely, from a senior courtier requesting a private discussion on values, expectations, and shared commitment to the crown's enduring legacy. A performance, really. One where the wrong answer could mean isolation, or worse. She didn't falter. She didn't confess. She smiled through the ritual, spoke the language they needed to hear. But inside, she knew. The game had changed. They didn't want the diamonds. They wanted obedience. But she would not give them either. Because what she held wasn't just a jewel. It was proof. Of betrayal. Of history rewritten. Of women erased for the comfort of men in power. And she would not let them erase her too. Still, she refused to give them what they wanted. And that defiance would come at a cost. Behind closed doors at Balmoral, two queens sat face to face. One born to rule, the other born to serve, but never yield. It wasn't a conversation. It was an ultimatum. Give them back. Lock them away. Or lose everything. But she didn't flinch. Not once. There are moments in royal history that are never photographed, never spoken of, yet shape the very core of the monarchy. This was one of them. A private meeting, far from court reporters and ceremonial fanfare, where tradition met resistance in its most unvarnished form. The Queen summoned her. No advisors, no aides, just two women seated in a room soaked in centuries of expectation and silence. The air between them was not cordial. It was electric, charged with secrets both had carried too long. The Queen, sovereign of a system built on unyielding control, did not ease into the conversation. "Some things," she said, her voice low but sharp, "are not yours to keep." It wasn't phrased as a request. It was an order dressed in civility. The diamonds, those unspoken relics, brimming with rebellion, had risen too far above the surface. Whispers had reached her ears, not just of their existence, but of her refusal to surrender them. She sat quietly, absorbing every word. every threat veiled in politeness. But she did not apologize. She didn't offer an explanation. Instead, she replied with a steel that few had ever heard in her voice before. "Then take it all," she said, each syllable deliberate. "But not this. This was not jewelry. It was not property. It was protest, and she was not about to let it be silenced." The Queen's eyes narrowed. Her tone shifted. What began as a lecture twisted into negotiation, one as old as the monarchy itself. Not a debate between equals, but between power and principle. The Queen warned her that ceremonial privileges could be revoked. Her position, already delicate, could be made difficult. Appearances could be limited. Influence quietly erased. But none of it moved her. She knew the cost. She'd already paid it in silence. What she hadn't done, and would not do, was surrender what had become her only true weapon against the weight of obedience. And it was then that the Queen invoked something darker, something almost never mentioned, even among family. "The ledger of shadows," she said, a phrase that landed like thunder between them. It was the name of a document so secret it existed outside the public archives, an internal record of royal affairs, disappearances, betrayals, the kind of document that buried people, reputations, and entire branches of the family tree. Her name, the Queen implied, could be added. Erased not by death, but by decree. For a moment, she said nothing, but her eyes did not waver. And that silence, unyielding, dangerous, was louder than any royal command. The Queen leaned in. "Then they'll come for you another way." It wasn't a threat, it was a prophecy. No crown was thrown, no tiara shattered. But when she rose from that chair, the battle lines had been drawn. She had stood her ground. But she had also placed herself in the crosshairs of a machine designed to absorb defiance and turn it into dust. She left that room changed. But the diamonds stayed with her. And their silence grew heavier by the year. It was supposed to be a routine inventory, a mundane task handed to a junior archivist. But when the box was accidentally dropped, the velvet split, and out spilled history's best-kept betrayal. Diamonds, black, blood red, and clear as ice. Unlisted, unaccounted for, and undeniably royal. The timing couldn't have been worse, or perhaps, in the eyes of fate, it couldn't have been better. She had passed only weeks before, and the vaults, those sealed chambers of legacy and loss, were undergoing quiet reshuffling. A generational transition had begun, titles reassigned, portraits moved, and within that slow but inevitable rearrangement, lower-tier staff were assigned to assist in cataloging lesser-known holdings. Among them, a young intern, barely trusted with gloves, was asked to verify item numbers in an auxiliary storage bay known simply as Chamber D. The box that broke the silence was mislabeled. No royal crest, no inventory code. Just a faded tag with the word "Private." When the intern moved it, it slipped from his hands. The fall was minor. The damage? Irreversible. The velvet tore. And in that split second, the room turned from silent to suffocating. Dozens of stones scattered across the floor. But these were no ordinary gems. Their colors were too unnatural. Their cuts too deliberate. Each one whispered of a lineage no official record dared to mention. He froze. And then the room responded. Silent alarms, normally reserved for high-security breaches, triggered without sound. Doors locked automatically. Within minutes, a lockdown. Within 10, 3 members of the palace legal team arrived, followed by 2 men from a department the intern would later refer to only as the ones without names. He was escorted out, not dismissed, not reprimanded, just removed, like a speck of dust on royal glass. Meanwhile, behind those sealed doors, panic unfolded. Senior royal historians were summoned, not to examine the jewels, but to explain them. And they couldn't, not publicly, not even privately, because these stones weren't supposed to exist. One whispered, trembling, "These were supposed to be lost." Another muttered about protocols, about documents burned during the last succession, but the truth sat gleaming in front of them. The jewels had survived. And now they were exposed. Within 25 minutes, every mention of the incident was scrubbed. The inventory system reverted. Security logs overwritten. The intern's clearance revoked. The floor was cleared. The stones resealed. Not in a new pouch, but in a black lockbox that required 3 simultaneous keys to open. And the directive followed was chillingly precise. An internal memo was circulated among only 6 people. No names, just positions. It read, "This never happened. Do you understand me?" No press release was issued, no photograph leaked. And yet, the tremors spread. Within days, one of the Queen's former advisors retired due to health. A senior historian relocated abroad. Another went silent entirely. His home office cleared by unknown officials. The palace, always so composed, began to twitch at the edges. The diamonds, her diamonds, had emerged, as if they had been waiting for her to be gone, waiting for the silence to crack, waiting to tell a story that had been buried in dust and velvet far too long. But secrets that big don't stay hidden forever, not when they come with a whisper of revenge. Tucked inside the diamond case was a letter, unsigned, unfinished, and unforgivable. She had written it, perhaps 100 times, never finding the courage to seal it. It was meant to reveal everything, but without a signature, it became the perfect ghost, untraceable, unreadable, and haunting. The letter was folded in thirds, worn at the edges, and tucked beneath the velvet lining like a confession she had meant to make, but never quite could. On the front, in her own delicate handwriting, were the words, "To whom the truth must fall." It was not addressed to a name, not to a title, but to fate, to the one who would inherit the burden she had carried in silence. Its discovery sent ripples through the already fragile silence surrounding the diamonds, and when its contents were read, they did not clarify. They cracked everything open. Inside, her words were raw, stripped of the polish and precision that had defined her public life. She wrote of the weight of secrecy, of the cost of dignity, of how the diamonds had become less of a possession and more of a sentence. She described sleepless nights spent tracing their history, trying to decide whether to expose them or destroy them, and always returning to the same fear, that the truth would not set her free, but destroy the innocent in its path. One line stood out, underlined twice, the ink smudged as if by tears. "He deserves to know, not because it will free him, but because silence will imprison him." The reference was unmistakable, a royal child. But who? That question sparked chaos behind palace walls. The family, already unsettled by the re-emergence of the diamonds, now faced the possibility that a member among them was unknowingly tied to the darkest secret of the house. But the letter, for all its fire, lacked one thing: a signature. And in the world of royal legalities, that absence rendered it powerless. Without a name, without a seal, without confirmation of authorship, the document could not be authenticated. Legal advisors, shaken and cornered, were forced to dismiss it as inconclusive expression. No action could be taken, no acknowledgement made. It was as though the letter didn't exist, and yet it did. burning in the background, leaking into every hallway of power. Whispers quickly began about a second letter, one that had been properly signed, properly sealed, but never found. Some believed she had destroyed it at the last minute. Others claimed it had been intercepted, taken before it could be read. A former valet mentioned seeing her clutching an envelope during her final visit to the vault. A housekeeper recalled a journal entry that simply read, "One sealed, one buried." But nothing ever surfaced. Only speculation. Only fear. What remained was this half-spoken scream from the grave, a truth so carefully constructed and yet too fragile to change the system it condemned. And yet, even in its unfinished form, the letter changed everything. Because someone, somewhere, was meant to receive it. And whoever that was, they would not forget. And yet, even unsigned, her final words cracked open a door no one could close. She wore them, not to a gala, not to a coronation, but to a private memorial, where only those who understood would see. It was her answer to silence, her inheritance of defiance. And when the flashbulbs caught the edge of a diamond no one could identify, the war began all over again. No one expected her to be the one, young, charismatic, a royal by blood, but not by proximity. She had kept a quiet distance from court politics, rarely photographed in traditional regalia, often dismissed by palace insiders as too modern to matter. But beneath the headlines and curated neutrality, something was stirring. She had inherited more than genes. She had inherited suspicion, and curiosity, and rage. A rage that had been passed down silently from woman to woman like a curse stitched into bone. And now, finally, she would wear it. The memorial was meant to be intimate, a closed-door gathering for those who claimed to know the late royal best. But one photograph, one accidental flash, captured the glint of something no one could place. It was subtle, but unmistakable. A diamond unlike any in the royal registry. Darker, sharper, wrong. It didn't match any known tiaras, any brooches, any records, and those who had buried the truth recognized it instantly. The palace scrambled. Journalists pounced. Mysterious jewel worn by royal at memorial, unlisted in crown records. The headlines were cautious at first, but soon the narrative splintered open. Experts weighed in. Former aides began whispering. And suddenly, international media latched on to what royal historians had spent decades trying to erase: the story of the blacklight diamonds. The official response was silence. No confirmation, no denial, just a calculated vacuum. But behind that silence, chaos. Phone calls were made. Meetings held in the darkest corners of the family's legal wing. And when they reached out to her, formally, privately, through a thickly veiled request to clarify the provenance of the jewel, they expected compliance. What they got instead was fire. She refused to surrender the diamond. Flatly. They were never yours to begin with, she told the palace liaison. They were hidden, not for protection, but for power. And I won't be part of that silence. Her response made it to the press within hours. Leaked? Perhaps. Strategic? Absolutely. Then came the interview. Measured, deliberate, explosive. She didn't name names. She didn't need to. Every sentence landed like a strike. She didn't hide them from the world, she said, staring straight into the camera. She hid them from you. There was no need to explain who you was. The monarchy knew. The world knew. And the palace, for once, had no words. But this wasn't just about a jewel. It was about reclaiming a story. About dragging truth out of the vault and into the light. The diamond wasn't an accessory. It was a declaration. worn not for beauty, but for battle. And its reappearance didn't just raise questions. It shattered illusions. It split generations, and it drew a line in the sand, one that could not be crossed without consequence. Because now, the silence was broken. And the legacy she'd inherited, the one they thought they had buried, had found a new voice. And with that, the diamonds were no longer a secret, but a weapon. She kept them hidden her entire life, not out of greed, but out of fear. Because she understood something the rest of the monarchy refused to. Some truths don't set you free. They imprison you. And now, those diamonds have returned to the light. But at what cost? In the end, she didn't speak. Not publicly. Not officially. She left behind no signed confession, no orchestrated reveal, only fragments, a trail of contradictions, inconsistencies, and whispers. And perhaps that was the most deliberate act of all, because silence gave her control over what the monarchy feared most: narrative. She knew that once the story became public, they could fight it, spin it, bury it under ceremony and distraction. But if it remained ambiguous, just enough truth to haunt them, just enough mystery to make them paranoid, then she had the final word, even in death. It wasn't cowardice, it was strategy. A slow, quiet resistance against a machine that crushes louder forms of rebellion. She understood what power looks like from inside the palace. Not loud, not bloody, but suffocating. 1,000 invisible expectations tightening around your throat until you forget you ever had a voice. And when she found those diamonds, she found not just a piece of forgotten history, but a mirror. A reflection of all the things the crown pretends it never did. Betrayals, banishments, secrets too corrupt to be polished into legend. She chose not to wear them, not to burn them, but to carry them, to hide them with intention, knowing they would one day resurface, not as heirlooms, but as evidence, because that's what they were. Evidence of something the monarchy has never truly reckoned with: its own darkness. The emotional cost of that choice is something no title prepares you for. Isolation disguised as duty. Affection coated in suspicion. The cruel realization that the closer you get to the throne, the further you drift from truth. In her private writings, those journals still guarded behind archival codes, she described the silence as a second skin. Something she wore so long it no longer felt like hiding. It felt like breathing. There are rumors still that other jewels remain hidden, that other letters exist, that another woman, somewhere within or just beyond the royal bloodline, knows more than she's allowed to say. Whether they're true hardly matters anymore. The story has taken on a life of its own, and stories, once awakened, are impossible to put back to sleep. In the end, the diamonds were never cursed. The curse was never in the stones. It was in the silence, in the weight of history too heavy to wear and too dangerous to speak. The crown insists it rules by legacy, but perhaps the truth is simpler and far more chilling. And so the story ends, not with justice, but with a deeper silence, one that glitters cold in the dark.